So as a quick raise of hands, how many of you are primarily Lando and how many of you are DDEV? Will the Lando people raise their hand? How many are DDEV? Ooh, it seems to be close to 50-50.
And fight.
Yeah. So that's gonna be interesting.
What about those who do both?
Okay, sure. Who does both at this point? Lando and DDEV, and go back and forward. That seems to be a smaller subset of the crowd. I'd probably say maybe 20% or less.
But I'm here because I'm trying to switch to
Well, if you're trying to switch, or if you're trying to learn more about what DDEV does for you and it provides, and maybe a little bit of why people like it, this is kind of the presentation for you. I tried to make sure to include a lot of the stuff that is in the docs and compare it not only to the Lando that I used in the past, but also to the Lando that is upcoming on beta 9, and why not with the Lando orchestrator, and why not. Just because, you know, being open source projects, I wanted to give it a fair shot and a fair comparison. And if later down the road somebody wants to do a DDEV to Lando, that'd be great. I mean, some of the things that I was looking on the DDEV docs are harder to extrapolate just because somehow on the Lando docs, how Lando is architecture. So if you know enough about Lando to do the reverse, that'd be fantastic, and I will be sitting there kind of like asking questions and filling in some gaps. So, who am I? My name is Bernardo Martinez. I work as a front-end developer at Voltis, which is a cybersecurity company based out of DC, and we primarily work on government contracts. I'm a co-organizer for the Chattanooga Drupal camp, which might be happening November 2nd this year, so be on the lookout in case you want to come to Chattanooga, Tennessee, and then check out our community and why not. But
Did you start the recording?
I did. I started it a little bit ago, so you should have everything, hopefully. So let's get started. From Lando to DDEV, a side-by-side migration. So what am I expecting you guys to potentially get out of this? I want to do a little bit of an overview of Lando and DDEV's architecture. Some of it I heard from different consultant firms that have switched from Lando to DDEV and why they did it, and I'll mention some examples about that. I'm also covering a little bit of where you will go if you have questions about DDEV, because I know Randy, there is, and I'll mention it a little later, there's a couple of different places where you can find support, but there is a recommended place, and if you go to the recommended one, it's more likely that you will have more people look at your issue the same way that you do with the Drupal Slack. And if you're not on the Drupal Slack, well, you know, the Drupal Slack is a great place for Drupal related questions. So what are we covering today? We're going to go a little bit into DDEV's architecture and project structure, the Lando versus DDEV commands, database management. It's a slightly different on how each project handles that. Lando events versus DDEV hooks, the plugins, the Lando plugins versus the DDEV add-ons, Lando tooling versus custom commands, and a couple of other elements that I might toss in there as well. I added the Lando auth versus the DDEV SSH auth because that's relevant in one of my examples. Personally, I don't know why sometimes, and you may relate, and those who have done Lando, and maybe it's not much of a problem for you anymore, but Lando auth, sometimes you have to do a couple of different things to get the SSH keys to work, and for a little while it had a few glitches here and there where if you're trying to load a different certificate, you have to point to it and whatnot, whereas the DDEV SSH auth usually doesn't get in the way on any of the projects that I had. So that is just something to think about and something to keep in mind. Not necessarily a deal breaker per se, but something to look for. So let's start with the architecture. What is different between DDEV and Lando? Lando, when you create a site, it usually includes an app server, includes a database, and includes whatever else you added as a service. And that is fine, though one of the issues that comes up with that is sometimes if you add 2 or 3 databases, you end up loading 3 different Docker images for those databases. But you may or may not know that MySQL can have a different database running on the same image. But Lando usually doesn't utilize that. And that's something that, talking to the peeps at Chromatic, and they could probably tell you a little more, they found out that was an issue just because if you have 20 databases that you're trying to load, then you're trying to spin up 20 different Docker containers for each one of those databases. Now, what does DDEV do in regards to that? DDEV has the DDEV database server. So it has a single database server. You pick whatever flavor you want, whether that is MySQL, Postgres, or MariaDB. And out of that, it creates one database container in which you can import those 20 databases. So it makes it so, depending on what your setup is, you could potentially see an improvement in performance just by the fact that you are not trying to build that many images all at the same time. But that's not the only thing. DDEV also comes with a single DDEV web server. The web server includes the multiple versions of PHP and a couple of different tools built inside of it. Whereas Lando, you would usually get the different plugins downloaded, and you may happen to have like 6 or 7 different containers depending on what you're calling and summoning. The DDEV web server on a future update might be the couple to pull out some of the older versions of PHP, because right now I think it goes back all the way to 5.6. And I know there's been some discussions in the DDEV community about making that web server image a little smaller, not necessarily a VM, not as much as a virtual machine, but more as a self-contained web server that has kind of like the latest and greatest, but still gives you the flexibility of being able to utilize what you need. Now, something that comes, a benefit that comes from the fact that DDEV has a single web server is that you never really have to do something like a Lando rebuild, because everything is already bundled on that image. You only have to do a DDEV restart. The restart swaps whatever you have in there, and since it's available on that image, you have it right away. So it saves you a couple of seconds or potentially a couple of minutes, depending on what you're doing, to just get up and running. Because every time that I use Lando, for every other thing that was slightly complex, I will have to do a rebuild, and the rebuild tends to take a little while. Also, I added the links to the documentation on some of the pages, so if you look at the slides later on, you can just kind of look at kind of like where I got some of those resources at. Some of my slides I kind of had to make them myself, because on this slide, the DDEV one, I got it straight from their website. So I know that's 100% reliable. The Lando one, I extrapolated that based on my experience and what I see when Docker Desktop is running. Not necessarily what might be happening, only because finding out Lando's architecture under the hood is a little trickier. Primarily because if you know, or maybe you didn't, Randy did a video series of contributing to DDEV last year, and he kind of released the plans of DDEVs, the underground, and everything has structure. So a lot of the data can be gathered from the videos, the blog posts, and other things. The one last thing I will mention about the Lando one is Lando has now, as of the latest release, the Lando Orchestrator, which may make some of these change in the future, and maybe that will improve and potentially make it easier to set up and make it more performant. But at the time of this recording, for me personally, the Lando Orchestrator didn't necessarily, I don't feel like it has improved the experience as much, because now you have to do a Lando setup every time you kind of try a new recipe. And then that's one step that sometimes the output of the terminal doesn't tell you about. So I found myself trying to start a lamb recipe from their website and then just failing a little bit just because I was missing the Lando setup command. So if you're a Lando user, which commands should you know? The three commands that are gonna be your bread and butter are the DDEV start, DDEV describe, and DDEV restart. Restart takes over Lando restart and rebuild because it does kind of like the same thing in most cases. DDEV describe, I talk a little more in the next slide because that does a couple of different things, but it takes the place of the Lando.info and the Lando describe, the config. So let's look at that. Now, project structure wise, what is different between Lando and DDEV? I should have mentioned this. If you happen to have a question and you feel like it's a quick question while I'm going through the different sections that you guys saw in the table of contents, feel free to raise your hand, and if it is something quickly, I will address it here. If it is something that's a little more time consuming, we could probably do a follow-up in the next session. I know Tim was talking about that yesterday, and then just have a little bit of an on-conference and then just go through your Lando file, or perhaps in-depth concern that you have or something that you haven't been able to achieve with DDEV, perhaps just because of the different project structure and the setup and some of the things that may be assumed, and we could try to improve the docs based on that. So if you start a project with Lando, you usually get the lando.yaml file, which is all the way over there on the left. And that is great, except for when you have to actually change it. I mean, I remember moving from Drupal VM into Lando. Lando made things so much simpler when it worked. But then, that was the little thing. If it didn't work, you had the problem that you had to kind of figure out what you wanted to add into it, and then go to the docs and figure out if that was the current version, because of course as the project evolves they might pull something in and out, but the simplicity that Lando has, I think, has probably been what's maybe biting it back a little bit, just because it gives you a nice clean file. But how do you add a proxy URL to that? Well, you have to go to the docs. So you happen to do like 20 trips to the docs potentially just to figure out how to change the alias, how to add the drush URI to make your site a little more easier to see, and maybe how to change the database version. But what does DDEV give you out of the box? If you launch DDEV, you get a directory, so you don't get a file. It's not a single file, so that's something that you are swapping. You're swapping a single file for a directory. And that directory has a bunch of different things inside of it. But the main file is the config.yaml file. And the config.yaml file has something special about it. The thing that's special about it is that not only does it include what most likely be the things that you potentially change, but it also includes 263 lines of commented out code and explanations about those keys that are on top. So you never really have to exit out of VS Code or PHP Storm or whatever tool you're using to look at what you need to change, because it includes examples and it includes what needs to go into those sections. So at least for me, that has saved me a little time, because then I just don't happen to have to go back and forward into like, oh, what does the additional FQDNs mean, and how do I actually add something in there? Does it need to be in this syntax, in that syntax? There's an example towards the bottom of the page. Now let's talk about DDEV describe. DDEV describe is a slightly different version. If you type DDEV describe you will get an output similar to what Lando.info does. And you can see that on this picture right here. It gives you what the web container URL is and any of the other services that come with it. But you may be wondering, how about Lando config? Because that sometimes tells you extra information that you may or may not need to know. How do you get some of that information? Well, because DDEV works in a container and a project-based fashion, you can go to the DDEV folder, and when your container is built, it generates that .DDEV as dash Docker Composer dash full, and that contains all the information that your Lando config will give you. So if for any reason, I never found myself going to the Lando config as much, but if for any reason you needed to dig extra information out of that, you can see the actual Docker file. Can you get the Docker file out of Lando? I'm not sure. I don't know if it is in a hidden place or maybe it is at the root directory, but I've never been able to see what the output of the Docker Compose file is for Lando itself.
In Lando, I think it's in your home directory under .lando.
Okay, cool. Yeah, that would be something to see and see how that compares. But basically, because you have access to it here inside of your project, you don't have to exit out or move anywhere else. But just for the recording, Angie just pointed out that it's usually on a hidden user folder. Cool. One little thing. You see those directories, files with the period in front of it? Those usually, and that's documented on the DDEV docs, those files are auto-generated by DDEV. So in DDEV you can attach stuff to the compose files at the beginning and at the end if you needed to. If you needed to add some sort of PHP module or something else that you wanted to load that doesn't come by default on the image. And we will talk a little bit about that. But if you see a period on it, it is a hidden file and it's not necessarily meant for you to change it there. There are ways to change it, but you shouldn't change it directly on that file. So what are some of the DDEV perks? NPM is built in. That was something that I usually just happened to spend a little time every time I did Lando. Because you needed the npm command, and you need the npm command to run inside a container. And people do that in Lando a bunch of different ways. Sometimes you can do that as a service, sometimes you install it with a build command, sometimes you do it a couple of other ways, but you don't have to worry about that. That's going to be on the first example. That's taken care of for you. Xdebug is built out. I mean, at my previous job at the university, I had to use Xdebug every now and then just getting it to work was tricky, just because there's so many different template files and so many different ways people were doing it. So if you're dealing with Xdebug, you don't have to worry about touching anything on the config.yaml or on the DDEV side itself. The drush alias, you don't have to do anything for that either. I think Mosh added that a while back, and so it automatically uses whatever you have as your folder name, and you can change it if you like. But in most cases, you can leave it be. You have the database snapshots. I know coming from Lando, I don't use that feature as much, but I know Matt Gleam and a couple of others have posted about using that with CI and why not, just to kind of like speed it up and test some backend settings. Now, these two are a little bit of a killer for me. It has full offline support. Now, I know Lando, I think, has improved on that. I didn't test it on a flight, but like with DDEV, I can just go on an airplane and then boot up whichever project I want, and it's ready to go. It may ask you to put in your password if it has to modify your local host, your host file, and why not, and put the DNS in there. But that is about it. And then you can do bash conditional logic, which I haven't figured out if you can do that in Lando. Does anybody know if you can do bash conditional logic in Lando? And we will see that in a little example. But yeah. So let's look at the first migration. So for this one, we're gonna go from events to hooks. We're gonna move some tooling from the DDEV, from the Lando tooling to DDEV custom commands. We're gonna do some add a port, and this example is actually what is powering DDEV.com, and I kind of worked a little bit with Randy to add it to the Astro project because I felt like it was important to be able to run Docker and DDEV itself on the website. And then he talks a little bit about the conditional logic itself. So let's talk about custom commands. So on that side, you have the tooling command that you may be used to in Lando. And on this side, you have an example of what DDEV already comes with. So I didn't really have to do anything. So if you go into the DDEV directory inside of web, you have a bunch of commands that are already pre-set up and give you kind of like a heads up of what you can do with DDEV itself. Like if you needed to find out how the npm command works, because you want to add a gulp command or something else, you can go look into that folder. And there's two places where you could find it. You can find it under global, or you could find it under the container itself. Because in some cases, you may not want it to have be a global command. You may just want to run it locally. But this example right here just exemplifies kind of like what you have to do. And it's already running because that's the Lando npm command. I mean the DDEV npm command. So you could just go there, copy that, and extend it if you needed to support gulp or anything else. Now, events versus hooks. What is the difference between a Lando event versus a DDEV hook? Inside of Lando events, sometimes you can do a build. But this comes down to the architecture on how Lando and DDEV load your files. So let's say you have a project. If you have your project and you are trying to modify something, what will be probably an easier way of explaining that? When you are using the Lando build, the way that Lando knows that you have a packet.json and a package.lock in your project is that it loads your home directory and the directory where the code lives into the container before it builds the container. And that generates some warnings from Docker Desktop for me. DDEV does it slightly different. DDEV doesn't load the code and the directory that you need until it builds the Docker file. And that makes it so you don't really have a build command, but you can work around the build command by either using the hooks or by using just the snippets inside of Docker Desktop. I don't know if that's clear, but one of them will load your code first and then the Docker file, and the other one will load the Docker file and then your code, if that makes sense. So let's look at the proxy. So what does the proxy do? In DDEV it's very explicit. In Lando, it usually sometimes assumes that you want to redirect a port. I'm going to explain the DDEV side for those that maybe are not familiar with that. So if you happen to have Beat running on container port 3000, you just tell it what you want the output port to be, and that's what you will get on your machine. And that should be it. I mean, on DDEV you can, on Lando you can do something similar, and sometimes if you have to redirect it, you can do a colon. But on DDEV it's just the same 4 lines of code that you're seeing there. So when it comes to the amount of code, it's kind of about the same. Now, custom images. Why would you want to add an extra setting to a container? You may want to think about potentially having some conditional logic if you need some build steps that are set in a row. But I think this is probably better exemplified later. So let me move to the next slide. So environment variables. This is important because sometimes you want to know if your project is running inside of Lando or if it's running inside of DDEV. DDEV gives you a bunch of environment variables for you to find out if the project is DDEV, if there's anything. You don't have to do anything to get this. You just do the $sign and then it's a DDEV project, and that it does it automatically for you out of the box. And that's why sometimes adding DDEV to a project tends to be a little easier, because it takes over your settings.php file if you don't disable a setting, and it just adds your file in there, and it makes it so it will read it only if you're running inside of DDEV. Lando has similar settings, but for some reason they don't have a specific setting for like is it a Lando project? I asked a friend from our Drupal users group, and he told me how he does it with Lando, but well, you can see it in the example as we come to it. So, conditional logic, what would we want that? At least on this example, what I was trying to do is, I was trying to make sure that I installed the npm after the container is ready. I was trying to make sure I will install the npm packages, and then when it finished telling me that it was installed, sequentially I wanted it to be able to just build it, because you cannot run npm run build if your files are not there, but that just lives on the project that I have. So my project has to be mounted inside of the container. So you can do that with some bash logic and just do bash-c. So if you have done some .sh scripts, you can do that, and now you have the same kind of structure that you will do with build inside of Lando, but with bash itself. So let's look at an example. This is the same site that I'm going to show you, but in Lando. It's DDEV.com basically in Lando, just running Astro, Node version 20, and then just kind of adding the proxy at the end. The reason why I went back and did it with Lando as well is because I thought, well, you know, if we're going to compare, it should be a fair comparison, and I should have both files, so you kind of can make your decision about what you like and maybe what you dislike, and also see the before and the after. So what are we adding? What are we doing here? We are adding the node service, exposing it, installing it, creating the new URL, and just adding npm as a command. Now here's the DDEV version of that, and that is actually what's powering DDEV.com local setup, so you can actually see that on the repo. But this does the same thing. Now there are some settings I didn't have to touch because they come out of the box like that. One of the settings that you may see in there is one that turns the database off, that it makes it so it doesn't have a database container because we don't need it for this. And then the other three commands that are in there is just mapping the ports, installing the packages, placing them in a background thread. I like that in Lando you don't have to worry about placing anything on a background thread. It kind of does it for you. But then if you didn't want to have that, then I don't know how you will actually just tell it to be in the main thread. But this will put it in the back thread and then just install it and run that when you execute the command. So that will make it, if you want to see a practical example of this, you just go to DDEV.com and then do a DDEV star, and you will see what the output of that file is. So let's go into the second one. The first one was just an Astro project. Now let's move into a Drupal project. For this, we're going to look at moving services into a custom command. We're going to look into build steps and whether you use the Docker image or hooks. We're going to look at the disable settings management in case that setting is important, primarily if you're trying to support both Lando and DDEV. I'm in a project right now where, you know, I mean, the communities themselves, there are people who are strong about Lando and using it. And I don't feel like, you know, I mean, if they want to use that tool, with this setting, you could potentially make it so you make it compatible with both. So if they want to use DDEV, they can use DDEV. If they want to use Lando, they can use Lando without having any issues. We look at the database and then just creating the project itself. Now, let's cover quickly database management. As I mentioned a little earlier, if you are handling a multi-site, depending on how big your multi-site is, Lando may be like, I know I have a friend from the local users group who was a little concerned because he has a database that might be 30 gigs and it's not his main database, but he's importing it. I don't know, there might be, because I haven't reached that point, a performance issue when you run just one image container if you're running databases that are gigantic. But as far as I've seen and from what I heard from other consultants, as long as the databases are pretty consistent, the database server, even though it's only one image, can run all your MySQL databases together inside of that one image. You would just create them and attach them to it. Any questions so far? No? Okay, let's keep going.
Is it possible to break out the database and run two database servers?
That is a great question. So my friend asked Randy that as well. He was like, well, but what if I want to have another one? Or if for whatever reason you want to have MariaDB and also a ProgressQL database. Right now, as it stands, if you needed to have both of them, you have to add a custom Docker container for it. Which, you know, granted, my friend didn't want to do that because it just increases the complexity of the project and you don't necessarily get it out of the box with that. You could also just have a separate project and then just link them and then do another project that just has that database. But yeah, those are kind of like the two current options. Now, I know I was talking to Randy about potentially having an add-on that will add a second database just in case that you needed it. But that is an architectural pattern. DDEV doesn't tries to make sure you just don't have a bunch of random databases added to your project. It's like one database which should be your main one, and then you can add more into that image container, but not necessarily have as many images as you want, unless you know you have that need and that requirement and are knowledgeable enough to like actually customize your own Docker compose file. Anything else? So something that is nice about DDEV, and I don't know about you all, but when I was working at the university, sometimes you will add a module and you want to see how many tables did this module mess up with. Because you don't want to necessarily break your site, and some modules just happen to add a lot of extra cruft that could potentially be dangerous because you might not be able to rip them out easily. Now with Lando, usually I will have to do a Lando config or a Lando info and figure out what the port is and try to map the port to either Table Plus or something else. If you just run DDEV Table Plus, it detects that you have that software installed on your machine and it launches the software with the ports and everything ready, so you don't really have to mess around with the info file or try to gather the ports or anything else. So it's just a little convenience that, at least for me, it saves me some time because with SQL Pro or something else, I don't have to worry about, oh, you know, what was the port, did it change? Because with Lando, every time you rebuild, or I remember if it is when you restart, sometimes it changes what port the database is listening to, unless you set it to be a static. But if it does that, then you have to keep going back and forward into like, oh, what port is it listening on right now? So now, let's talk about environment variables, but the user provided ones. Because you may have a Google Maps key that you might need to provide or something like that that you would like to have. There's a couple of different ways you can do it, but like if you needed to have them as a file, in Lando, as you can see over there in the left in dark mode, you can just set an environment_file as a key and then just give it the file location. In DDEV, there's a couple of different ways you can do it. You can either set a web environment key inside of the config.yaml, or you can just define a .env inside of the .ddev folder, and that will pick up your environment variables and then you can add them in there. And the .env is ignored by default, so you wouldn't have any issues if you're using the complete DDEV settings, the managed settings. So here's a simple Drupal website running on DDEV. Let me point some things out as we're looking at them. So you see that I am providing the Drush options URI. The only reason why I'm doing that is because I told DDEV to let me to set up the managed settings as false. And if you have the managed settings as false, then it will require you to actually define what the Drush options is. And having it as false makes it so it doesn't take over your settings of PHP file. And by doing that, it means that you have to do this one extra step. But that's the only step that you really have to do if you disable the management settings. Why do you want to disable the management settings? Because if you don't disable the management settings, then DDEV will attach itself to the settings.php and add a statement, and I think I have another slide with that statement, that will say if it is a DDEV environment. So if you don't want to touch the settings.php file and you want to use settings.local, you can disable that, but you just give it the drush URI is in there. Now, this is an example of where you will find the environment variables. So if you happen to have a Google Maps API or some other type of API, you can just add a .env file right here, done. You don't even have to tell it what the path is, because since DDEV has its own directory, it will automatically look for that file if it exists. It doesn't have a file like that by default, but if you add the file, then you are done. Now let's look at an example. On this one right here, what is 4 things that I always have to do with Lando? Well, first I have to install Node some sort of way. Then I have to add the drush URI option. And as far as I know, up till now, there's not an easy way to just tell Lando, just do that for me. And then you have to add xdebug if you're gonna use it, and potentially patch any bugs that might have come out since. Now, I went back to a previous project and looked at this file, because I was trying to kind of see what things I might be able to reference, and then hopefully you can see the screen. I noticed that, at least for Lando, a struggle that I always had was, well, go ahead and find a Lando.yaml example online. Like, everybody does the same stuff, but it's rare that you find a Lando.yaml example that is open source and that you can copy and potentially just add your stuff, because it's still a Drupal site. You may be using npm and one more thing, but if you just had a template and a starter, you should be good to go. I don't necessarily know why Lando didn't really publish some of those. I think that would have been a fantastic idea, but maybe they didn't want to do some maintenance on them. What you will notice on this screen is, this is my file, kind of like the file I used at a previous job at a university. I happened to stumble upon the file that inspired my file, and that was based on something that Mike Madison had done for Drupal for Gov. And I imagine if you did something similar to what I did back in the day, and maybe even now, your file is inspired by some other file that somebody either gave you or you found somewhere. Which is good, except for you never clean the crap out of that Lando file, do you? Because, yeah, good luck cleaning the crap. You're going to blow it up potentially, and you'll be like, so that's one of those things. So this is actually a real example that I used. I don't even know if the SSH fix here still is relevant, but I wouldn't touch that because it was working, you know, when I left. So I was like, oh, why bother? That's something you usually don't have to struggle with DDEV, and maybe you won't have to with the newer version of Lando once they come out with 4.0 and it's stable. But as of now, that's something you don't have to worry about, because all the keys work, and if they didn't, he could take them out or make sure Randy will clean them in the next release. But you might be asking, well, where are npm and xdebug? I know we talked about, you know, them being built up and why not. If you look into global commands, and the other reason why I'm going back to this is because you have the examples. I always wanted that with Lando a little bit because I love the simplicity. I don't love the fact that I have an empty file that I don't know anything about, and that only the docs can potentially help me if they are relevant and they are still up to date. And they do a decent job, but still, you know, keeping the docs up to date, that's a whole different challenge altogether. So if you went to DDEV, you see global commands, all the global commands that you have for the latest version of DDEV, and if any of those commands doesn't inspire you to just tweak it a little bit and make your own, you can look into some extra commands that he has added on the website itself. And then over here, this setting, this is the setting that I was talking about a little earlier, disable settings management. You only really need that if you're trying to support both Lando and DDEV in my experience, at least so far. If you let it be as it is and you're migrating, you can just leave that out, and then you don't need the drush options URI, because DDEV will do that for you. Though you may want to use the web environment here if you're just changing what the Drupal private path or the config folder is. You could put it on the .env. But that is another alternate option to have. I don't know if having it here is recommended, because I mean, the config sync, maybe it will be a little bit of a security issue at some point if you just had it there. Maybe not. Not sure. But you could have the variables there if you don't have any concerns when it comes to the security in the config.yaml. If it is something that is private and you don't want to have any issues, just put it in the .env file, and then it will just be on your local.
Excuse me.
Go ahead.
Can you help me understand global commands? Does global commands mean for all my DDEV projects, or does it just mean the default commands within a project?
Global commands are the commands that come on all the DDEV projects.
But the directory is within my project, isn't it?
That is correct. So when you do a DDEV config, it will load all those commands by default, and it won't issue them in the terminal, because you see it has the artisan command, but I'm not doing Laravel. It just has the example for you to potentially look into it if you had to do something similar to what artisan does inside of DDEV. It automatically detects that I don't have artisan. If I was to do a DDEV commands or just a plain DDEV, it will tell me a DDEV list. It will tell me which commands I have available, whether that is the Magento one if I'm running Magento, or the WordPress one. But I can still look at that and reference it. But that will be in all the projects that you have. That's included in your directory as you do a DDEV config. Same thing as you do a DDEV init, this comes with it. But it doesn't apply to you, then you can just leave it there. Does that make sense?
I see the global commands in my home directory, not in the project directory.
Oh, well, I was pretty sure maybe, are you running the latest version? Because I took this screenshot from my project directory, and I know it has the globals, it has .globals commands, which is a hidden folder, and then it has a commands, because you can also localize them so they are not global, and they can run just in your project itself. Like sometimes I just do it for my web host, because you can set commands only to run on the database, or commands that only run on your web container. So what does this do? What disable settings management do is it doesn't generate the settings.ddev file, which is the way. So this piece of code right here is what Randy added. So when you do a DDEV config to a Drupal project, you don't have to worry about messing up with your settings.php file. This thing right here, you don't even have to uncomment the settings.local, because it will take over the file. But you may not want it to take over, because then you will have a git diff that has a change on the settings.php file. And if you just disable that, then this won't go in here. You won't have the settings the settings.ddev, and then you just have to do that on your own. But you may just want to do this first, so you can have that file, then uncomment this, and then that way you have all the boilerplate that you need, and you can still just reference this. You can copy this piece of code and put it into your settings.local. And then that way you can have support for both Lando and DDEV. Now, is there is Lando project? I haven't found it, but this is the closest thing that I found that I told you the guy from my local user group pointed out to me. I mean, he just did a Lando info and decoded that JSON to figure out whether it was a Lando environment and kind of wrap it with that. If you do that in your settings .local, then you could have support for both Lando and DDEV, because you could switch environments depending on which one it is, and make some of the Lando users happy and some of the DDEV users happy if they want to use both. So that's something out there, something to keep in mind. But you don't have to. It's probably a little harder to have both, but like if somebody's very passionate about one of them. And this is his Drupal user username, in case you were wondering. So, at least at the university, a challenge that we had was we used BLT, which you may or may not use. It was a project that was sponsored by Acquia, and they kind of just killed it, kind of Lightning and a couple of other things. But anyway, that's a separate rant. So BLT was great because it did a couple of different things. It had like import database and a couple of different things that were specific to Acquia environments. But let's say that you wanted to have a command like that. In Lando, you will have it under tooling, and then you would just tell it that you wanted to attach that to the app service, and then just what the command that you wanted was. On DDEV, you could either go see what DDEV does with Rush under the global commands, or you could just run it on the web host under commands. and then just have those options. And then DDEV kind of gives you this code, this boilerplate as default. If it says DDEV generated, don't touch it unless you want to remove that, but then you have to maintain it. So if it is your own file and you're going to support BLT or any other project, then you can just copy this, get rid of the DDEV generated, and then just make it match. Just just change the annotation to be whatever the description you want, and then change some of the settings there. So that's the second one. Ooh, I'm starting to run out of time. So let's try to go quickly through the third one. So the third one does something very similar, except for it mentions a little bit the add-on services. Okay, so for this one, let's say that you need to do something to the Docker image, but it is something that is independent of your project. Sometimes you may want to add a PHP module to the Docker image that you don't have by default on DDEV, or like in the example from DDEV.com, like you want to add the Gatsby CLI, and the Gatsby CLI is not available, and you want to have it pre-installed inside of the container. One thing you can do is modify the Docker file itself to add that by extending it, and I added a link to that. It's just basically you add the snippet of code that you need inside of this file, inside of the Docker file, and you can prepend it because. So there's two ways of doing it. You can override what the Docker file is going to have if you wanted to take over the whole Docker file that DDEV builds and modify the whole thing yourself, but you can actually prepend and postpend. And that's one way to do it. But you have to keep in mind that you couldn't do this for like npm install from your project. Like the Astro project that I showed you earlier, you couldn't do that with this because then my project hasn't loaded into the container. This is done before. Your folder that is in your home directory or wherever you have it is only loaded after Docker finishes building up the image. So that's something to keep in mind. The Lando plugins versus DDEV add-ons. DDEV add-ons, there's a bunch of them out there. You can have PHP MyAdmin, you can have a storybook,
Mailhog?
you can have well, the thing is Mailhog, I think just got replaced by MailPit because
Something like that though? To catch emails?
yes, so MailPit comes as part of the web server image by default now. So you don't even have to do anything. If you do a DDEV describe, it will tell you MailPit URL is. It used to be an add-on that Tyler36 had. I don't know if you guys are familiar with that username, but he's a big contributor to DDEV and also to Drupal itself. He used to have an add-on, but then Randy incorporated that because he felt like that was important, and that's where a lot of the Laravel and PHP community geared towards, especially because Mailhog kind of was under security. Well, it was unsupported, basically. So anyway, so you have it out of the box, so you don't really have to do that for a MailPit anymore. But for some other things, you may want to have to add the add-on. And adding the add-on is just as easy as there's just, you can do the DDEV add-on and then the name, and then you have it, and then it's just running in your container. So here's a little example of that. You have this is the Lando example of that. You have an environment file, you have a PHP MyAdmin service, and where you are defining that in there, you have the custom Drush URI, mailhost service, gulp, and npm. And you may be wondering, well, how will that look inside of DDEV? In DDEV, you don't have to do anything when it comes to the environment file. You don't have to define where it is. You just have to put this file here. You just create the file, it's done. You don't have to define the custom Drush URI if you are just doing a straight DDEV project, or if you're just only going to support DDEV, you're done with that. The npm command, you don't have to do anything. The mailhot service, it already comes with MailPit, and you can actually just do DDEV launch-m, and it will basically open MailPit for you in the browser window, and then you can just start exploring and looking at some of that information. But what about PHP MyAdmin? You might be wondering, oh, well, I do want that, I don't know why you will, because DDEV used to have it built as part of the web image and it was in core, but Randy, they took it out and put it as a side thing, because now people use Table Plus or something that is a little faster and it doesn't look a little outdated, because PHP MyAdmin looked outdated back in the day, so you can imagine that nowadays it's a little extra. And then go. So then you can do DDEV-list and it will list all of the DDEV ones, and this one is PHP MyAdmin. If you just run that command, it will add a PHP MyAdmin, the container, and then you can just access that from DDEV describe, and then just have access to your information. Now, you might be wondering, is there a question? Okay. You might be wondering, how about the gulp command? What if I need to add gulp? I have one project that uses gulp nowadays. Well, if you went to the web directory and then you looked into some of the commands that are in there, whether that's on the globals command, usually the globals command is a good one to reference, because you can go into commands, and commands doesn't have as many examples because it's just when it's running on your local, but that one does. Then you can just look at what Randy does for the npm command, and that's basically what I use and what I copy to support DDEV gulp. And then I just change my variables. The add symbol just tells it pass the arguments, because you may want to run something specific that gulp has, like your update WDS or update something. I use USWDS, so sometimes they have their own specific gulp file and settings, so then you can just pass those. And you could have that inside of the web directory, which is inside of the customs command, if you wanted to have it, inside of the commands folder, if you wanted to have it just in the web directory. But if you wanted to make it global and you wanted to target a path, you can also give that command a path if you just wanted to run globally, kind of like what Lando does, and then just run it from your home directory instead of having to cd into themes, specifically where that gulp file is. And you don't have to go all the way or have another terminal if you didn't need to.
So on that, so you're saying that if I wanted to have a gulp command, I'd have to create a file in web, and then that would be the contents of the file on the right?
That is correct. If you wanted to have the gulp command show up as part of the DDEV commands, you would just go look into the global commands, do a command that's very similar to your needs, and then you wouldn't necessarily have to add it inside of web. I believe the docs reference, inside of global commands, you can just do it under commands, because both of them are directories. And then you can just add this here. And if you add this, the annotation works similar to like the Drupal annotation, where it automatically picks and reads some of this information, and it knows that it has flags, and you can use -- help, or why not, to figure out if there's something else. And it tells you the description. Oops. But yeah.
And the file name is what the command would be?
The file name, I think you could name the file whatever, but I usually follow the file name being the same as the command, because gulp is not provided out of the box, so even it's not something that's there.
Thanks.
So some extra resources in case that you wanted to know. Well, all these projects need more contributors. I know I follow Lando and their Lando's channel as well, and they've been asking for people to give more input, and why not? So if you're passionate about Lando, make sure to take some time to help them out and test some of the early releases, and then contribute it with code, marketing, or something else. But if you're contributing with code, this slide is for you. Something that I really like that DDEV did last year, and Randy said that he was going to do this year as well, is that he posted training on all the different parts of DDEV, and you can see that at DDEV.com on one of the blog posts. And so if you wanted to learn more about how it's tested, if you wanted to learn more about how to support it, the marketing, this is actually how I got familiar with DDEV.com and kind of became involved, because I saw the video of Matt Stain, who actually created the Astro project, and that kind of inspired me to like, if you can already get started, and if they explain a little bit to you, you have an easier time potentially giving back to the community. Lando recipes versus DDEV quick starts. I tried to do a Lando recipe, and not necessarily to bash on the Lando team, but I tried to do the Drupal 10 one, but for some reason it didn't work. And I powered off DDEV, and I make sure everything, and I don't know if it's because they're targeting the dev branch for Drupal, but if you just want to get started with DDEV quickly, just go here and then just copy that stuff and paste it. I use that all the time for contribution when I need to have a Drupal VM, just stand up if you don't want to use any other system, just copy that and you're good to go. It will log you in and launch. We just open the browser window for you. One quick note, if you go see the DDEV docs, make sure you pay attention to that yellow bar on the top, because sometimes the DDEV latest shows up on the Google search results a little faster than the stable. The latest, sometimes the command may not work because that's not code that has been released on a stable release of DDEV. That is code that is upcoming and that Randy hasn't released. So I know that's something that we were working on the other day, just adding that warning, the yellow warning, and the dark mode support for that. So you go to stable. Stable has everything, and everything should work in stable. Check out the DDEV store if you want to get some goodies, these t-shirts and a bunch of other stuff. You can buy some there and support the project. All the proceeds go to the DDEV Foundation. It's not a lot of proceeds, but you know, it's mostly for marketing purposes. Because if people show a little bit of their love, you know, people know which tool you're using, and why not? Same as any other thing. And feel free to connect with us at the Chattanooga Drupal users group, or Meetup is actually one of the few that still does a hybrid mode, I think. So if you want to join in, we have it once a month on the third week of every month. Lee Walker usually leads that one. And we just hang out and talk a little bit about Drupal and different things that we're working on. And then we might be having the Drupal camp November 2nd, so be on the lookout for that. And that icon on the top, that's Discord right there, and that is where the DDEV community lives. And Randy has been trying to get most people, from any community really, but most of the Drupal people to post their questions there, because it's easier for everybody to give feedback. So if you're having issues and you want to have some support, download that app. And if you tell your kids or grandkids or anybody else, I'm sure they're going to think you're hip, because that is like, you know, Slack for little kids. Well, yeah, so that's a little tidbit right there. Make sure to add in your feedback. And any questions before I wrap up? If not, then thank you.